Hi everyone, and welcome to today's session on queries versus parameters. What's the difference and which should you use when you're building Power Query solutions? If this is the first time you've been to one of my presentations, hello, I'm Ken Puls, and I am a fully qualified accountant based out of Canada. I'm also the owner of the excelguru.ca website, where we have a bunch of help articles and a free help forum. I'm also one of the founding partners behind skillwave.training, a project that I run with my colleague Matt Allington, where we actually teach people how to get the very most out of advanced Excel and Power BI. I'm a Microsoft MVP and have been awarded that distinction every year since 2006 across a variety of different categories that look after Excel and Power BI. I'm also a software developer and author. I've written 3 books, the most important of which is Master Your Data, which covers Power Query. And I also write the Monkey Tools add-in, which will actually help you build better Excel models faster by doing a lot of your Power Query work for you. Now, before we dive into today's technical content, I'd like to quickly define some terms and how I use them as I'm presenting this information. All right, so let's start with query, what we generally build in Power Query. A query to me is something that reads from an external data source because that's what I use Power Query for. Now, the important thing to know about this is that it could return any Power Query value. This could be a piece of text, it could be a list, it could be a table, anything that Power Query can return as a value, that's what we're looking at in this case. So queries are pretty general. We then get into specific types of queries. The next one that I want to introduce you to is what we call a scalar query. And what a scalar is where we're drilling down to a single primitive value. Now, these are values that are not complex, okay? So a single piece of text, a single date, or a single numeric value. Now, what's interesting about a scalar query, though, is that they can still be complex in that they can reference other data sources as long as they're drilling down to that single primitive value. It's the output that makes it the scalar query. This is the important point. When we look at things like lists or tables, these are not scalar. The reason being is because scalar is all about being a single thing, where a list or a table contains multiple components to it. There's multiple rows and cells inside a table. So therefore, we want to get back to that single primitive value of a text or a date or a value. Now, the next one that I want to introduce you to is what I call a simple query. What is a simple query? A simple query is a single step query which returns a scalar value. What this means is that these never ever connect to an external data source. A simple piece of text that we enter into a query in one step. It's not dynamic in any way, it's hard-coded. That's what I refer to as a simple query. Okay, so those are my 3 definitions that are going to be important as we start going through this presentation. All right, so let's talk about parameters now. I have a different definition of parameters than what the Power Query team does. To me, a parameter is any scalar value that is being used to drive another query or filter. That's what it's for. It's a parameter that is being used to dynamically generate content in some way. We also have a term that I refer to as official parameters. And these are the parameters that are actually created via the parameters dialog. And you think, well, that's weird, Ken. Why would you have these 2 terms if the Power Query team's got one called parameters? Why would you think of something differently? And the answer is, well, because I've been working with Power Query for a long time, and I actually built a function called fnGetParameter to go and get scalar values out of an Excel worksheet long before the parameters button was ever introduced in Power Query. Like, we're talking years before. So for me, this term has been around for a long time. And honestly, I actually find that scalar queries are much more functional for my Excel workflows than the official parameters that we got. And don't get me wrong, official parameters have their uses. I'm going to show you where those come in today. But at the same time, I can't kick that term of parameters because I've been using it for so long, and that's what they do, is drive the results of other things. In just a minute, we're going to hop into some demos here, and what I want to show you here is a mixture of queries and parameters and where their strengths and weaknesses lie. So I'm going to show you some of the good things that happen, some of the bad things that happen, why you might want one over another. We're going to use 2 main demos here. These demos are going to start with this one. We're going to go into the dev production switch. Now, if you've worked on building Power Queries for any amount of time, you've probably felt the pain if you're working with a large data set where you do something like, I don't know, apply a filter. And then you've got to wait for several seconds for the data to apply the filter before you can move on to the next step of maybe removing rows. Then you got to wait for a bunch more time before you can move on to the next step of assigning a data type. And then you got to wait and so forth. You get the idea. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how we can use a technique here to create a development/production switch to work on a smaller data set so that we can actually react to our data much faster in development and then push it out to production where we don't have to wait for every single step to refresh. That's going to be our first scenario we're going to look at, and we need to decide, is this a query versus a parameter kind of thing that we need to do here? The second thing that we're going to look at is I'm going to build a custom function for a dynamic calendar. Now, I use this for all kinds of interesting things like building fiscal Friday calendars and 445 calendars and non-standard year ends. But for right now, we're just going to keep it simple. It's just going to be a dynamic 12-month calendar that ends on December 31st. The most important process that I want you to see here is how do we go through and build a dynamic calendar and create a custom function to do this using entirely the user interface along the way. So it's going to be a simple calendar, but it's going to show you that process of where queries and parameters have some real strengths and weaknesses here. So if you're ready, let's go and hop into a demo now. All right, so this is my sample file that I'm going to be working with, and you can see over on the right-hand side here that we have a few different queries and parameters that I've already created. So what I'm going to start with is I'm just going to show you what I've actually done here. So I'm going to pick up any one of these things. I'll just start with Excel file dev. I'm going to double click on that. We'll open this up in Power Query and have a quick little look here. All right, so the first thing that I want you to notice here is that the Excel dev query that I'm looking at has a single step, okay? In addition, you'll notice that this is just a piece of text, which makes this a simple query. It is a single step query that returns one piece of information resulting in a scalar value. Okay, so there we go, a very simple query. Excel file prod is the same thing. As a matter of fact, you'll notice that they are both called chit stash something. This is all of my chits, which are my receipts when I'm working in food and beverage. The Excel file dev is pointing to a chits file, which is specifically carved down to just December 2013. Meanwhile, I have file path over here, and you can notice by the icon here that this one is going to look a little different. When we select it, it comes back and it's got a manage parameter. And if I click on manage parameter, and I could create new ones, as you see, by working through these dialogues here, but manage parameter will take me directly in here. And we can see that what I've done is I've gone into new and I've created a new parameter, official parameter called file path, given it a description, told that I want text, any value, and I've put in the path to my data folder. I'm going to hit cancel on that one right now, but if I ever need to change it, I need to come into Power Query and actually make the change right here. Of course, if I ever need to change Excel file dev or prod, I have to do the same thing. I've got to come into Power Query to change them. These are scalar queries. This one is an official parameter, and I've made choices here for a reason. Now we also have two queries over here. We've got chits dev and chits prod. And if I take a look at chits dev, you'll notice that in this case here, I have a step right at the beginning, which is a little bit unusual, called target file. Now I've done this by actually editing the code in the advanced editor and putting in my own step name, which is basically taking the file path official parameter and joining it with an and backslash sign to the Excel file dev simple scalar query. And this results in my file path here that actually comes out to the full file path for the 2013-12 chits file. From here, my source step is saying I'm going to grab my Excel workbook, get file contents. You do this by just connecting to importing an Excel workbook, and I replace the file path with the previous step named target file, which is obviously feeding in this value. So that brings me back to the Excel workbook. I've drilled into a specific table, chits, by just clicking on it here. That's taken me into the data for this particular dev file, and then I've applied a change type step. So this is pretty simple so far. There's not much difference between chits dev and chits prod. The big difference between these two is the first step that refers to Excel file prod instead of Excel file dev. That gives me a different file path, which means that this is a file that has over 1,000 rows of data. We can see that by looking right down in the bottom here. We can also see if we go back to chits dev, this one also has over 1,000 rows of data, but it's much smaller than the full production file. So that's what I've got set up so far. Well, the question is, why and what am I going to do with it? So the first thing that I want to do is I want to set up a switch to make it very easy to change between my development and my production file. Because if I start working the production file, it's going to take much longer to do every step because it's going to need to wait for a refresh. So what I want is I want something the user is generally not going to play with, but is going to find easier enough to change should they need to do so in future. So for this case, a parameter makes a fantastic choice because we can actually provide a drop-down option. So I'm going to go to New Parameter under the Manage Parameters dialog here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a parameter here, which is called Data File. All right, so this is going to be for my switch between dev and prod. I'm going to provide this one here. I'm going to tell it that I would like a textual value in this particular case here. And I'm going to provide a list of values. And those values are going to be dev. And we're going to go and add another one here for prod. My default value that I'm going to choose is going to be dev. And my current value as well is going to be dev at this particular point. Now, realistically, you might want to make your default prod, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter inside Power Query for Excel because you have to come in here to change it anyway. It's not like Power BI where you can actually change it in the Power BI service, which is one of the nice things about parameters as well. So for right now, we'll leave this as required. We're going to go and say OK, and you'll notice that we get a new parameter here called data file dev. So this is good. What I now want to do is I want to actually use something that actually makes this happen. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to right-click on chits dev, and I'm going to choose to reference it. And you'll notice we get a new query called chits dev 2, which I'm just going to double-click here and rename this one and call it staging-chits. I'm going to move this into my staging queries right here. There we go. The challenge is right now, of course, it's pointing to chits dev. This is not dynamic in any way. So here is what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and say if data file equals dev, then chits dev, else we're going to go with chits prod. So it's a fairly simple if statement written the Power Query way where you have to spell it out with the if then else. But at this point I can now hit enter and you'll see that nothing's really changed. And that's because the dev switch is pointing to dev, so we're still getting the same query. Let's see what happens here. So right now, we can see that we've got a December 1st, 2013 as our first row of data. Let's go back to our data file. I'm going to change this via the dropdown, nice and easy with a parameter, which is pretty awesome. We're going to make it prod. And if I now go back to staging chits, notice that this is now an April 14th, 2009 line. So we've actually switched out to the other file. Now, as it happens, I've got previews cached on my machine here, which is why this actually worked really, really quickly. If I didn't, this would have taken a bunch of time to generate because this file is actually, fairly sizable. But for right now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make my development life a little bit easier. So I'm going to go back to data file here. I'm going to change this back to dev. And now I know that my staging chits is again working on my December 2013 transactions. So that's the first part. If you're looking for that drop-down list capability, then at that point, a parameter works really, really nicely for you. A scalar query is not going to do that because, of course, it's just a single value. So there's the first part. Now, how am I going to go and actually use all this? Well, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm actually going to load staging chits as a connection-only query. So we're going to go and say close and load to, and I'm going to load this as a connection-only query and say OK. And there we go. Staging chits is now loaded there nicely. And what I'm now going to do is I'm going to go and quickly build a data model off of this thing so that I've got something to work with here as I'm building out my solution. So to do that, I'm going to go right click. We're going to choose reference. I'm going to jump back into Power Query here. And I'm going to make myself a few different little tables here. So I'm going to start by making myself an items table. I'm just going to move this into my data model folder that I created just to keep myself organized here. And the only two things that I actually want on this table are item and category. So I'm going to grab both of those, right click and remove other columns. I am going to grab the item column and choose to remove duplicates. There we go, that looks pretty good. And then I'm going to grab both of these guys here. We're going to right click and hang on a second, let me make sure I've got both of them. And then I'm going to go to transform and detect data types to set a data type step. I always like to make sure the last step before I load to my data model tables is to define the data types, and that way I never get any weird things happening as stuff is going on later on when data loads. And last thing I want to see is something that comes back as an any data type, because that can cause some real problems. So by forcing that change type step on there, I know that I'm going to get something that's always coming back, in this case as text. All right, let's do another table. We're going to go right click on staging chits again. I'm going to choose reference. This time I'm going to go and make a table for chit IDs. I'm going to bring that up because that's going to go into my data model as well. This one here is going to be right click, remove other columns on chit ID, right click, remove duplicates. There we go. And then I'll set the data type on this one as well. Even though it is a whole number that's showing here, I'm going to force it to be a whole number just to be absolutely certain. Okay, so if somebody creeps in with a text, this will cause an error in it later on, but that's okay. I'd rather have that knowing something's gone wrong, and I can always change it out later on. All right. The last one I need to do is I need to build a fact table. So those are both of my dimensions for filtering. We're going to go and reference this. I'm going to double click on it here, and this one is going to be my actual chits themselves. Go and move that up into this area here. And I'm going to get rid of, in this case here, there's only one column that I need to get rid of. That is actually my category column. I can get that through the items table. So I'm just going to delete that. And I'm going to create myself a new column here by grabbing units and amount. I'm going to go to add column, standard. We're going to multiply this. And this new column, I'm just going to rename this right in the step up here. I'm going to go and call this one sales dollars. There we go. And that is multiplying my units via by my amount in order to get my sales dollar column here. I'm now going to go press Control A to select all of my columns, go to transform, detect data types, and at this point I'm quickly going to spin through these and just make sure that the data types look okay. So units apparently can have decimals. I'll leave that as a decimal number. My amounts, I know that these ones here will always be a maximum of 2 decimal numbers, so I'm going to change this to a currency. I'm not sure with the units. Somebody might, reverse engineer a unit to get to a certain price, so I'm going to leave that one long. But for this one, we'll make amounts a currency to force them to a maximum of 4 decimal places. And sales, same thing. We're going to round that one off so that it goes to a maximum of 4 decimal places. That's what a currency holds for you there. So there we go. That looks pretty good. And these 3 tables now, I'm going to choose to say home, close and load 2. And we're going to load these guys as connection only, but also to the Power Pivot data model. So there we go. Those are going to load into the data model so that we have them ready to go. And we can see that they've now loaded nicely with a whole bunch of rows into the data model ready to go. All right, so I've got a fact table and I've got 2 dimension tables, but if I want to go and start filtering on any kind of a date format for any kind of time intelligence, I'm missing a dimension table for my data model, and that is my calendar table. And obviously there wasn't a calendar table in the file, so I'm going to need to create one myself. So let's go and hop back into Power Query. I'm just going to double click on the items table to launch myself back into Power Query. It doesn't really matter which query I want. It's just the fastest way to get back in there. And now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to start by laying myself some groundwork to build a custom function in order to build the calendar the way that I want. So I'm going to start by doing this. I'm going to come down to my parameter section here. I'm just going to go right click on this folder. I'm going to choose new query from other sources, and I'm going to choose to create a blank query. And you can obviously do this from the Get Data menu in Excel, navigating through the same path. You can come out to your blank query. And you'll notice here that it's flashing in the formula bar and it's asking me what I want to do. So what I'm going to start with here is I'm just going to type in a date. Now, I'm going to use the ISO 8601 standard for this, okay, of year, month, day, because that's the defaults that I've set up on my computer to understand. So here we go. I hit enter, and what you can see is that I've now created a simple scalar query. One step, does not connect to a data source, returns a scalar value. Okay, so a simple scalar query. Now I'm going to go and just grab this guy here and I'm going to rename this. I'm going to call it start date underscore P, which indicates parameter. You'll see why this is going to be in the case here later. I'm now going to go right click on this one and I'm going to duplicate it. I'm going to rename this one. We're going to call this one end date underscore P for parameter because I'm trying to drive a parameter to drive something else. This one, of course, we're going to modify to be December 31st. All right. Now, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to create a new function, but I'm going to start by creating something called a sample calendar. So here we go. I'm going to go, let's go right click on my staging query right now. We'll go new query from other sources, once again from blank query. And this is where we're going to do the majority of the coding I'm going to do in this session. I'm going to say equals curly brace. This is going to create a list. We're going to say int64.from. That says I would like you to convert whatever is between these parentheses into a whole number. Okay, and I'm going to type in start date underscore P. So there we go. So we're going to convert start date P, which was the year, into the date serial number. That's where I'm going to start for my list. I'm then going to go up to int64.from, open parenthesis, and we're going to go to end date underscore P. Okay, so we're going to go from the first date to the last date, converting them both into date serial numbers so that we can get a list of numeric values in between. And at this point in time, this is what we've got. We've got a nice little list here that lists all of the date serial numbers between the start date and the end date. So this is a good start for our calendar table. I'm now going to convert this into a proper table. So we're just going to click on convert to table. We'll say okay. We're now out of a list into something that's a lot more useful for us. I'm going to rename that first column and call it date. I am going to set the data type instead of an any. We're going to convert these date serial numbers back into dates, and boom, there we go. We've got our calendar table starting January 1st, 2021, running all the way through to December 31st, 2021, 365 rows. I'm now going to go to add column, date, year, and year. There we go, that looks nice. And I'm going to go and select my date column again. We'll go to add column, date. Let's go with month. We'll grab the numeric month. We're also going to go back here and say date, month. We'll grab name of month, and then I'm going to grab my month name column, go to transform, and I'm going to extract the first 3 characters from my month name. I don't really like full month names. I prefer to have the shortened version in my charts and things like that, so that looks much, much better. And as my last step, of course, this is eventually going to load to the data model, so I'm going to collect all of those columns there, select date, press Control A, go to transform, detect data types, and you'll notice that it locks in my data type step. So there we go. This is my sample calendar. Why a sample? Well, because this is working with hard-coded dates from 2021. But of course, you've seen that my data was covering 2013 back to much earlier, so I need this to be quite dynamic. So that's going to be the next stage here is I want to use this as a basis of a function, but I want to be able to dynamically pass in some dates, which is why I set up start date P and end date P. All right, so let's try this. What we're going to do is we're going to go and say, right click, create function. And you'll notice it comes back and says, I didn't find any parameters. And we said, well, wait a minute, but I set these 2 things up as parameters. It says, I'm sorry, but those are not parameters. Those are scalar queries. They're not official parameters. So we're going to go and say cancel on this because this isn't going to work very well. But I'm going to show you something kind of interesting here. If we go back to start date P, let me just collapse some of these things here to get the stuff out of the way that we don't need. If we go back to start date P is a simple scalar query. Single step, doesn't refer to a data source. I can right click on it and I can choose to convert to an official parameter. And what you'll see here is that it converts it now to an official parameter. If I go and take a look at it, we can see that it said, oh, okay, well, this can be in any data type. I mean, that's fine. I could change it if I want to be a date. Doesn't really matter. Any will work just fine for right now. But you'll notice it now shows up in this dialog. I'll say, okay, let's go and convert end date P, convert to parameter. So this is now showing the parameter icon as well. And now, here's what's interesting, is when we go to sample calendar, when we go and say right click and we choose to create function, it comes up and it says, hey, cool, I can create you a function for this and we're going to use the parameters start date P and end date P. Now I really, really wish that we could actually have scalar queries work inside this area as well. That would be brilliant. I mean, I've put them in, it's referring to another place. Why can't I just have that work in the function thing? But unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. So I'm gonna go and create this one. I'm gonna call it FX calendar. I'm gonna try and spell that a little bit nicer. There we go, FX calendar, that's my function. It takes start date P and end date P, which are gonna be dynamically passed into it in order to create a calendar for whatever period I actually want. And you'll notice that when I do this, it actually goes and puts all of the stuff, the FX calendar, the sample calendar, and the parameters that are applicable to it, it puts them all in a single folder here called FX calendar. Now I'm gonna go and say, let's go and move this to a new group. We'll go move to a new group here, and I'm gonna call this one functions, just to get it into a different area so that we can see what's going on. So there we go. We now have a functions folder that have FX calendar in it with its individual pieces here. Okay, so that all looks pretty good. Now, we've now managed to go and build a custom function that we can use for whatever we want. So this is brilliant. Now we just got to go and actually do something with it. So here is exactly what we're going to do. We're going to go and create a couple more queries that read from our data source in order to populate these two values. And in this case, we do not want parameters because I can never dynamically drive one of these things. There are some hacks behind the scenes to do it, but they're very fragile. They just don't work. It's not the way things are intended to go. So here's what we're going to do right now. I'm going to collapse my parameters folder. I'm going to go to staging chits. And I'm going to right click and I'm going to choose to reference this. Now the question is, what do I want to find here? Well, what I'm interested in is I'm interested in the earliest date that ever shows up in this particular column here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on date. We're going to choose remove other columns. We're then going to go and we're going to say, we're going to filter to the earliest date. So I'm going to go date filter is earliest. We've got a whole bunch of December 1st, 2013s. We're going to right click. We're going to remove duplicates. There we go. I'm then going to take this one because I always want my calendar to cover the entire fiscal year. So I'm going to go and transform this. We're going to go to date, year, start of year. There we go. Now this next step is actually really important. Even though this shows as a date here, we're actually going to convert this to be a date. By putting in this step here, you make sure that this pattern always works. And this is something I actually teach in my self-service BI bootcamps, is how to build these dynamic calendars. Once we have this in place, we can then right click on the data point itself, right click and choose drill down, and we'll get down to a scalar value. Now notice though, this is not a simple query because it's got multiple steps. It reads from a data source, but it is bringing back a scalar value. So it's a scalar query. So I'm going to go and I'm going to rename this one. I'm going to call this one start date underscore Q for query. Okay. Now let me go and get my start date end. So we're going to go right click, reference. I'll just rename this one now. Well, let's call it end date rather. End date underscore Q. There we go. And I'm going to basically do the same thing, but with the end of year. So we're going to remove other columns. We're going to go and filter date filters to is latest. We're going to go right click, remove duplicates. We're going to grab this, transform it, this time to date, year, end of year, change it to a date, and then right click and drill down. Now, I've now got start date Q and end date Q, which are both returning scalar values. However, they're reading this data from my data source. So this is, every time I refresh now, start date Q will always be the beginning of the year for the earliest date in my data set, and end date Q will be the end of the year for the latest date in my data set. So I can build something up to cover the entire year for my data sets. So this is good. What I'm now going to do is I'm quickly going to go and say, let's go close and load 2. And we're going to load all of these queries that I've just created here as connection only. And there we go. They've now loaded nicely as connection only, and I've got the groundwork set to go and actually build my calendar table. So let's do that now. I'm going to jump back into Power Query, and I'm just going to go and double click on anything here. Start date Q is the closest query to my mouse, so that's what I double clicked on first. All right, now I'm going to quickly just go and collapse some of these things down here a little bit. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create myself a new query. This is going to load to the data model because that's where it needs to go. So I'm going to go create a new query, and once again, from other sources, from blank query. For this one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to leverage my calendar function. So we're going to say equals fx calendar, and you can see that it shows up in the IntelliSense. I'll hit tab and open my parenthesis here. And fx calendar takes two components. We need a starting date and we need an ending date. So I'm going to start by typing in, and I get my choices, start date P or start date Q. Well, start date Q has been dynamically driven by my data. It is a scalar query, that's great, and that's what I need. So we're going to go start date Q, and we're going to go to end date Q. Now remember, I don't want to go with P here because P needs to be manually set. Q is dynamically reading from the data, and they're both parameters to my mind, but the official parameter is static, but used, I can pass a dynamic value into it so it can be replaced on the fly when the query is actually being executed, the function. So let's take a look and see what happens here. Notice our calendar is now running from January 1st, 2013. Remember, if we go back and we look at our function here, these dates are 2021. When we look at our sample calendar using the parameters that we built, the sample calendar is working from 2021. But because start date Q is returning a 2013 date and end date Q, also a 2013 date, when we feed those into the parameters here, which is what we've done, we've passed in start date Q and end date Q into these two parameter fields, it replaces them inside our function and uses those as the dates that our sample is being based off of, which is pretty nice. Now the sample is always going to be based on the static values, but when you actually execute it, it uses what you pass in here. So let's go and rename this. Let's call this calendar. And now I want to show you why you would actually go through the process of building this stuff up manually. Because you look at it and you go, okay, well, that's awesome, but what if I needed some more stuff in my calendar? What if I needed to add quarter? I mean, I could certainly do that here right in the calendar table, but I also have the ability now to go back to my sample calendar. This is the one that I built that I then converted into a function, and check this out. We'll go add column, date, quarter, quarter of year. So we've added this in our sample. Let's go back to calendar. Boom, there it is. Because when you modify your sample query that you converted into a function, those two things are actually somewhat linked. So any change you make in the sample calendar will flow into FX calendar, which we leveraged by passing it in start date Q and end date Q. And we now have a dynamic calendar that's using and generating all of the columns that we needed to have here. So this is actually pretty darn cool stuff because we've done a whole bunch of coding here. by using user interface driven buttons. And this is something that I've taught in the Power Query for years, or in our Power Query Academy for years, is how to actually build these manually without even having the sample counter. As I say, I've been doing this a long time. These things came out way late, and I was teaching people how to build custom functions before this kind of functionality ever showed up. So it's pretty cool stuff to be able to actually go and build this and leave yourself a nice little piece here that you can go back and use the user interface to make modifications and changes. Notice here again, we've got official parameters that we use to drive the samples, but we're using scalar queries in order to drive the actual data. You could not convert your scalar query to an official parameter here. Notice it won't let you do it because it has multiple steps. Why does it have multiple steps? Well, because we're reading from a data source and drilling down into what we need. So that can't be used as an official parameter. Okay, so just kind of an interesting little piece here around the components on these things and how they sort of fit together along the way. Now, one of the things that's kind of interesting here is that, I'm just give you a little bit of a diversion as we go through some of these pieces here, is that all of our parameters at this point in time, our official parameters, is that they've been manually typed. And one of the bonuses of parameters over queries is that they actually show up in dialogues. Our scalar queries don't. And what do I actually mean by that? Well, let's go take a look at the chits query for a second. So I've got a lot of different dates in this, right? What if I wanted to set a filter to say, hey, I want to make sure that this is after a certain date. So I'm going to go in here, I'm going to click my drop down, I'm going to go to date filters, and I'm going to say is after. And when we do this, you'll notice it comes up with my nice little dialog here and it says, all right, is it after? And I can put in a specific date. I can go and pick a specific date from a calendar. That's all cool. Under my drop down though, notice that it will allow me to use parameters. So I could come back and say, hey, let's make sure that it's after start date P. But notice that the list that it gives you here is only parameters. It does not give you the ability to say after start date Q, which is a scalar query. This is actually really, really frustrating to me because there are often times when I want to dynamically drive something from my data and use that for a filter somewhere else. So this will work just fine, right? I can go and say, okay. And at this point in time, it's going to be giving me a little bit of a challenge here because start date P is 2021 and I'm working with 2013 data. On the other hand, start date Q is the beginning of the year for our data. So if I hit this and change it, you'll notice that it actually brings things in. So if you're ever trying to set a filter using a scalar query, you can do that. The problem is it won't show up in those dialogues. So generally the way that I would do that is I would go and say, let's set a filter. We're going to go to date filter and we'll say choose whatever filter you want. We'll say after. And I'm just going to go and put in a date. And it really doesn't matter what it is. So this is going to be going with a date in early 2024. Obviously, it's going to return nothing. The important part is that it actually shows the entire date up here. And if we select this entire piece, we can now replace it with our scalar query's name. And at that point, it will work. Now, I wish, I'm going to get rid of that because we don't actually need it. I wish that those dialogues actually showed the results of scalar queries. And a little bit later, I'll give you something to vote on if you'd actually like to see that change. So at this point in time, all of our data prep is done. We've now built a beautiful calendar table to go with all of the individual components that we actually need here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to home. We're going to go close and load to. I've only built one query in this specific setup, and that was my calendar table. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add it to the data model and say, okay. And we'll let this one load, and if everything works nicely, we get 365 rows, as you can see here. So that is brilliant. All right, so now we need to see the results of the hard work. Is this actually working for us? How do we actually use it in the real world? So what I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to go and build my data model. So let's hop over to Power Pivot tab. We'll go to Manage and hop into the Power Pivot editor. And you can see that we've got all of the data is nicely set up here with our 4 individual little tables that we have, but there's no schema linking these together at this point in time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make some changes along the way there in order to make that happen. So Chits is my fact table. I'm going to go and drop that over here, and we'll put our chit ID, link that together. There we go. So that's going to look a little nicer there. We're going to grab our items table and we'll link our item together. That looks good. Nice. We'll grab our calendar here, and I'm going to link my date to my calendar table as well. And then as a a good practice here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hide all of the fields that I use for my linking keys. So chit ID. We'll hide from client tools. We'll force people to use the one from my dimension table. For my items table, we're going to go and hide that one from client tools. And for my calendar, we're going to hide date from client tools as well. So now we've just left our numeric columns behind the scenes here. I'm also going to hop into my calendar table here really quick and do a little bit of sorting. So we'll go back to data view. I'm going to hop down to calendar. I'm going to grab my month name, sort by column, and I'm going to sort this by the month number. And this is just because a lot of people don't really like to have their month sorted alphabetically. That's kind of not, well, it's sort of normal that most people don't like that. So this will allow me to sort them by the numeric month number instead, so that January comes up first and February comes up second. All right. So that's where I'm starting with my Power Pivot side of things. I'm now going to go and close this one here. And I'm going to create myself a new pivot. I'm just going to put it over here in cell L9, I think, right around there. That looks probably like a good place. And we're going to go to the Insert tab and choose to insert a pivot table from the data model. We'll say OK. There we go. And you can see that I've got all of my individual fields are all laid out here, so that's fantastic. So let me go and build something up for this one. Let's go and say from our items table, we'll put category on rows here. For our columns from our calendar table, we're going to put year on columns, and then we'll put our month name under columns as well. So we can see we're sorting from January, February, March all the way through to December. That looks pretty good. I could go to my chits table and drag sales dollars on here as an implicit measure. I would prefer to do this as an explicit measure. So let's just go quickly make a new measure for this one. We're going to go to Power Pivots, Measures, New Measure. And let's make a new measure here called sales. And this is going to be the sum of my sales dollar column from the chits table. There we go. I'll just make that a little bigger so we can see. Check it, make sure that it works. I was pretty confident that with a symbol one like that, it would work. We'll go currency with no symbol. I'm going to drop off the decimal places though. And we're going to say, okay. And at this point, it adds it in. And what we can see is that we only have December. Now remember, we've been working through this thing using our chits dev file, which only contains December transactions. So this is actually by design, but it is a little bit weird. So I'm going to make a couple more changes to this pivot table here. And here's what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and grab this one. We're going to go to pivot table design. I'm going to change this to show in outline form because that's my preferred form for this. I'm going to turn off my grand totals so that they're on for columns only rather. There we go. And I think I'm going to go and right click and I'm going to collapse the entire field on my years down so you don't actually see the month names as well. Now this looks a little ugly right now because month name is on the pivot, but at the end of the day, I'm actually okay with this because here's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to go over to my queries pane and I'm going to go and find my data file, which is using the dev switch. I'm going to double click on this to open it up because we do have to edit this through Power Query. And I'm going to change this to prod. All right, now this is now pointing to the much larger file. So here's the question. Does it work? So let's go close and load. And what we're going to do is we're going to go to data, refresh all. And at this point, all of my data tables should be going back and refreshing from the data source. Previously, that was the Excel dev file that only had the December 2013 transactions in it. You can see this is actually taking quite some time though. These files are much, much bigger. So it's got to go through and do the entire process where it was fairly quick when we were actually architecting it and building it. But we'll just wait for this one to go through and do its thing and hopefully bring us back a whole bunch more data. And boom, after a little while, it came back and we now have all of our data available to us. So this is the nice benefit of the dev versus prod switch, is that we can build on a much smaller file along the way to really allow us to actually build our Power Query without too much delay along the way, not having to wait for steps to refresh all over the place. And then when we're ready, we can flip the switch and do a refresh, and we only have to wait for a single load. This is a much, much better world than having to wait every time we do any kind of step in Power Query. Like renaming a query kicks off an entire refresh of the data set. So this is a really, really helpful little technique where a parameter drives it quite nicely because we get that drop-down list. The only thing I don't love about that, it would be really nice if there was something on a ribbon where we could change the value of a parameter right from Excel without having to go into Power Query. But unfortunately, that's not the case. So in this case, though, it works quite nicely. You've now seen a mixture of queries and parameters at play in real-world solutions that we can actually use to build something that reacts the way that we actually want. All right, so now that we've seen queries and parameters in action, let's go back and review what are the benefits and drawbacks of using queries as parameters versus the official parameters that the Power Query team gives us. We'll start with queries. Let's start with the benefits. And the first benefit, the biggest benefit, honestly, is you can drive them dynamically from your data. Where parameters act as placeholders to be replaced, the huge benefit of queries is that we can actually link them to other queries, filter down to the specific data points we need, adjust them to fit into where we need them to be, like I did by adjusting my start date and end date to the beginning and end of year in order to dynamically drive the other components of my solutions. I do this in virtually every single solution that I build using Power Query. It's always about dynamic data, dynamic boundaries, and things like that. And this is the huge advantage of using queries as a parameter per se to drive your solutions. Now, the other thing that this implies is that if you can read from a data source, well, the Excel worksheet is a data source. So if you set up a table of parameters, you can actually read those in using Power Query, get down to the single scalar value you need to drive other solutions. And this means that right in the Excel grid, you can update your parameters very, very easily. That's a complete difference to the official parameter, which you have to adjust from inside Power Query. Now, another big component about this is because you're actually coding this all in M code, these things get released when you, or preserved rather, when you release it to the audience. What you code inside your M code is going to stick around. And you think, okay, well, that's kind of an odd comment to make, except that while it's not true in Excel, if you're using parameters in Power BI and you deploy it as a template, all of the parameters are actually wiped out and cleared. The intent is that the user can pop in what they actually need. But in Excel, because it doesn't work the same way, well, it's maybe not as big an issue, but it still is a factor that you want to think about, particularly if you try to take some of the stuff over to Power BI. Now, the drawbacks of using queries as parameters, right off the bat here, when you go and you build yourself a sample function, if you're using queries to drive it, you go to right click and enable the create function button. While it will let you create a function, it doesn't recognize your queries as parameters and therefore doesn't give you a fully parameterized function to be able to leverage in future. And this is really, really frustrating, honestly, but it's just the way it works. So spin up a couple of placeholder parameters, use those when you're building your custom functions, and then feed them with a dynamic value when you invoke your function, as I did by creating that new step of FX calendar and putting in the components I needed within the parenthesis. The other thing that is a little bit more frustrating and potentially something that the team will fix for us is that our queries don't show in dialog dropdowns. And my personal feeling is if they are a scalar query, they should show in a dynamic dropdown just the same way that a parameter does. If you would like the Power Query team to fix this, please go to this URL here. This is my short URL to get you right to where you need to vote for it on the powerbi.com ideas site. And this will hopefully, if we can get enough votes, get the team to go and actually change the behavior on this so that when you're actually working through, say, a filter dropdown or something else, you can actually choose scalar queries in addition to parameters and actually make it nice and easy. I mean, remember, you can still do it. You just have to hack the formula bar. That shouldn't be necessary. You should be able to just be saying, hey, look, I want to pull it from, a particular data type, or I want to change it to parameters or scalar query, and it should give you that list of scalar queries right there to make it easy to pick without having to write any code whatsoever. If you like that idea, please vote. Help us out with that. I'd really appreciate it. All right, so let's talk now about parameters. The benefits of parameters. Well, number one, they show in dropdowns. That's pretty awesome right off the bat, right? They also allow us to enable the create function button by giving us things that we can then fill in the values that we need. So that's also pretty darn cool. But the drawbacks, well, the drawbacks is that parameters, by their very nature, are placeholders to be replaced, but they themselves are not dynamic. Now, I'm going to tell you that if you do, you think, oh, I'm sure I can hack that. If you go and do some research, you'll probably find that most places that actually have information around this are actually my blog. I've been experimenting with this for a long time, and I'm going to tell you that my recommendation is don't do it. Every time that I've played around here and figured that, oh, I've got a parameter to actually work in a dynamic fashion, you make a modification to it, it breaks. It's so fragile. It's just not worth it. It's not worth going there at all. Okay, so that's the first one. The other side that really frustrates me with parameters is that you have to go into the Power Query editor to update them. Now, if you're in Power BI and you publish to the Power BI service, you can update your parameters right in the Power BI service. Fantastic for dev and prod switches. You can do all your building in dev on your desktop. When you publish it to the service, you can just flip it to prod. Nobody needs to know. That's brilliant. In Excel, you have to open the Power Query editor. I really wish that there was an option right in the Excel ribbon to change these things, but unfortunately, it's just not there. So that's one of the big drawbacks around the official parameters themselves. Not that queries give you that, except that, again, remember, with queries, you could actually set it up to read from the Excel grid so you don't have to open the Power Query editor, which is the way I think parameters should work. All right, so at the end of the day, we've kind of got three choices here of different constructs that we can use when we're building our solutions. We've got our scalar queries that are dynamic. We've got our simple scalar queries. We've got our parameters. So which one would you use when? So here's my general rule of thumb for this. Again, remembering there are always exceptions to every rule, but typically the way that I think about it is this. For a scalar query, dynamically driven values. If I want to read from something like earliest and latest dates from my calendar, or minimum maximum values, or dynamic values for filtering, if I'm going to be reading from a data source, distilling it down to an individual data point to use somewhere else in my solution, then I'm going to go with a scalar query. Okay, that's my first rule of thumb on this one here. What about a simple scalar query? This is the one that's hard-coded, the data sources don't change, and that's really what drives it right there, is if they're constants that are used in solution. These are really good for things like file names. Notice, remember my chits dev versus chits all. Those two things, the name of the file isn't going to change ever. The other part of the path might, but there's a path is another one, right? If you're using a SharePoint URL, that's never going to change in the organization. On the other hand, if you're using a local file path that's stored in a OneDrive folder that's always changing based on who the user is, well, that I'd push to a scalar query because we're going to need to read that and it changes often. The scalar queries are constants that don't change. And remember, we can put them together with something else later on if we need to. As far as official parameters, well, if you're going to be driving a custom function, you want to build yourself a sample transform, you've got to use parameters in order to make that happen. So that's going to be one of my first rule of thumbs that I go to. The second one is if I want to provide a user with something's changeable, it's an advanced user that's not afraid of going into the Power Query editor, and I want to give them a simple drop-down list, at that point in time, I might go with one of these for things like dev or prod flags. Now keep in mind, if I don't want the user going into the Power Query editor for whatever reason, then at that point, I'm probably going to set up a table in Excel and I'm going to use a scalar query in order to bring things in unless I need a parameter for some other reason, like driving the function. So those are my general rule of thumb and choices around how I decide which one to pursue up front. Now, if you'd like to learn more about Power Query, I'd invite you to check out some of the resources that I have. You can pick up my book, Master Your Data. This is probably one of the cheapest ways to get into some really good technical content. If you're interested more in an on-demand video course, we have a fantastic Power Query Academy at skillwave.training. And I also have a bunch of Power Query recipe cards that'll help you transform, kind of gives you a playbook to say, here's my data that it starts, this is what I want it to get to, and these are the steps it needs to go through. You can check out the pricing and availability for all of these options at our Skillwave training site. Thanks for coming to my presentation today. If you'd like to download the example files and slide decks used in this presentation, you can do so at this link here. If you're interested in learning more about our training products, I invite you to check out skillwave.training. And finally, if you'd like a What's New in Office 365 monthly newsletter, maybe some free ebooks, and learn about other things that I do, you can sign up for my newsletter at this link here. Thanks so much for coming to my presentation. I hope you learned something cool and interesting that will actually change the way that you do things. I'm looking forward to seeing you in another presentation soon.